Dr. Sneha and Philip. Kerala, India was home to the brilliant and fiercely independent young Dr. Sneha and Philip. Her disturbing disappearance in September 2001, in the hours before the 9/11 terrorist attacks, cut short her unwavering care for her patients, her curiosity in various arts, and her desire to see the world. Everyone who knew her in the Manhattan community and throughout New York City at large was left searching for answers in a sea of mysteries that left us all feeling lost in doubt. This analysis looks at Sneha and Philip's disappearance in the years leading up to one of the worst days in American history and the decades-long struggle her family waged to clear her name and ultimately preserve her heroic legacy. The goal is to present more compelling arguments based on factual data and situational analysis. On October 7, 1969, Sneha and Philip were born to doctors. Kerala, an Indian state located directly on the Malabar coast, is home to Kokiel and Ansu Philip. Sneha became a part of a trio. Her brother Ashvin was born before her. She was first introduced to the Philip family not long before her parents welcomed their second son. This individual goes by Kevin. Even as a small child, the only girl got along well with both of her brothers, creating a playful connection that frequently involved lengthy days full of excitement and laughing. However, the Phillips family determined after a few years that their stay in Kerala, India, was coming to an end. Believing that moving to the U.S. would be the ideal option for both Dr. The Phillipses, a bright and growing family, relocated to upstate New York due to Kokiel's logic and career. After arriving, Sneha and the others made their home in Hopewell Junction. Before we continue, we want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch our videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy our content, consider subscribing. It's free. Now, let's move on with the video. A Dutchess County hamlet and census-designated place near Poughkeepsie, New York. When Sneha finally arrived in America, she adjusted to the many cultures and lifestyles around her rather well. She developed a particular fondness for the beautiful arts in particular, and she was particularly drawn to writing, painting, and music. Sneha had a wide range of interests. Her artistic endeavors were just one aspect of them. Throughout her latter childhood, a number of her classmates and teachers noted how she combined a deep-seated empathy for others with an astonishing level of intelligence for her age. Sneha's altruistic tendencies persisted throughout high school, when she made the decision to study medicine and eventually earn a doctorate. Naturally, there was some hesitation in doing this. Sneha continued to have a strong connection to the arts and thought about defying convention by choosing to major in painting or a related field in college rather than official medicine. Ultimately, though, the arguments were won by the certain promise of a medical profession. Inspired by her father's medical career, Sneha enrolled in the Chicago School of Medicine in 1995, following her graduation from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Sneha met Ron Lieberman, a Los Angeles transplant student studying 1 year behind her, while she was a fellow doctor-in-waiting at Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science, also known as RFS. Not just on a personal level, the two fell in love right away. Sneha discovered after a few chats that Ron was a fellow artist who performed in his spare time and loved music in general. Sneha, who also enjoys painting, saw that the two could combine their personal and professional lives, and they began dating. Sneha even took a year off from school during Ron's penultimate year at RFS in order to travel across the Italian countryside and graduate and enter the post-graduation stage simultaneously. Following their graduation from RFS, the couple relocated to Lower Manhattan's East Village district in New York City, where they both secured nearby internships. While Sneha was employed at the Cabrini Medical Center, Ron discovered a chance at the Bronx's Jacobi Medical Center. In May 2000, Ron and Sneha tied the knot in a private ceremony in the Dutchess County home of the Phillips siblings. The event turned out to be really special, as both families included elements of their Indian Christian and Jewish heritages. In fact, Ron gave Sneha a minu, a customary bridal jewelry given to brides in Malayali Christian traditions, at the wedding. This one had a diamond placed in the shape of a golden teardrop. That would be the same necklace that her parents had been frantically searching for in September of 2001. Their only daughter, who had once seemed full of promise, vanished without a trace when the World Trade Center Twin Towers were terrorized. Now let's look at the sequence of events that led up to Sneha becoming missing. Sneha and Ron, who had recently tied the knot, moved into a larger apartment in Battery Park City during the summer of 2000, just a few blocks from the World Trade Center. In the spring of 2001, almost a year later, Sneha receives word from her director of residence that her contracts will not be extended. After just a few months, she was hired by Staten Island ST. That summer of 2000, Sneha was suspended from Vincent Medical Center for not attending her scheduled meetings with her drug abuse counselor following her treatment for alcoholism. Before the attacks on Friday, her mother went to see Sneha. They spent time together, had dinner, and watched a movie. Sneha spent the nights there, and the day before she left, she mentioned that she wished she still had a closer relationship with her mother. On September 10th, Sneha appeared in court early in the morning and entered a not guilty plea to the allegation of making a false complaint. At 11 in the morning, Ron leaves their apartment on Rector Place for work, leaving Sneha alone. Sneha spends the remainder of the morning tidying things before her cousin Anu arrives on Wednesday, September 12th. Sneha repots white-purple orchids from Hawaii in the early afternoon and dries them in the bathtub. She texts her mother between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, chatting about Ron's guitar performance at a recent event at Jacobi Medical Center and her wish to see windows on the global restaurants on the rooftop of North WTC Tower, where a friend was being married in the spring of 2002. Sneha then changes into sandals, a brown short-sleeve dress, and ties her hair back into a ponytail between 4 and 5 p.m. Shortly after the clock chimes 5 times, she leaves. Sneha leaves her dry cleaning between 5 and 6 o'clock in the evening and goes to Century 21 to shop at a bargain mall. It's a short distance from the residences, just a few blocks past the Twin Towers. She visits the department store to get underwear, a fresh outfit, pantyhose, and clean sheets for the apartments. There's a transaction at that same Century 21 just after 6 p.m. using Ron's American Express credit card, which Sneha was allowed to use. She strolls to the store next door between 6 and 7 p.m. and purchases 3 pairs of shoes from the shoe annex. During the 2-hour shopping spree, Sneha is captured on CCTV inspecting the department store's apparel. This would be Sneha and Philip's final verified sighting. Ron gets home from work just before midnight later that evening. In addition to Sneha's absence, he observes that she has not left any voicemails, something she did not want her to do late one night. Ron checked on Figa and Carly, the 2 house cats, and made sure they were okay before turning in for the night on September 11th, 2001. Ron receives a missed call on his cell phone from a phone line within the apartment at 4 in the morning the next day. The only other person with access to the house is Sneha, but Ron claims he hardly remembers checking his voicemail at that time and doesn't recall ever receiving a call. 2.5 hours later, Ron awakens on his own to his 6:30 alarm once more. He is first irritated, but then learns that Sneha most likely just spent the night at her brother's or relative's house in West Village, which is a common occurrence. He hurriedly gets ready and takes the Uptown 5 train to Jacobi Medical Center to pick up the parts. Ron shows up for the 8 a.m. meeting, blissfully unaware of the impending disaster, just like all the other blissfully uninformed New Yorkers in the city. American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 carrying 92 people, crashes between floors 93 and 99 on the north face of the North Tower, also known as 1WC, at the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, New York City, 46 minutes later at 40 seconds past 8:46 a.m. After a short while, Ron departs from a conference at Jacobi Medical Center. When he comes out of the room, his colleagues are crammed around a TV. A news report about a jet crash into the World Trade Center, which is only a few blocks from his flat, is shown to him as he gets closer. Immediately, thoughts of Snare cross his head. Everyone initially thinks the jet crash is an accident, but that quickly changes when United Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 767 carrying 65 people, hits between floors 7,785 on the south face of the South Tower, often known as 2WTC, at 9:03 in the morning. Ron calls his Battery Park apartment urgently about the same time, hoping to get through to Sneha, but no one answers. In case Sneha needs to get in touch with him when she gets home, he leaves his phone number on the voicemail. Ron then gets in touch with Sneha's mother and brother, who haven't heard from his wife either, following that fruitless attempt. In the meantime, the horrific September 11th events are still happening all around the country. In a span of 30 minutes, the World Trade Center's South Tower collapses at 9:59, Flight 93 crashes in Somerset County, Pennsylvania at 10:03, and the North Tower collapses at 10:28. American Airlines Flight 77 crashes into the west side of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. at 9:37 a.m. United Airlines Flight 93 is seized by its passengers from the hijackers, who are ostensibly headed to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. at 9:57 a.m. Ron stays by himself and muses over all the possible endings for Sneha while the chaos raging through Manhattan and other places decimates the entire country. His possibilities include becoming a victim of the World Trade Center attacks herself, being abducted, and being murdered. Ron decides around 3 p.m. to leave work and search for his wife after hours of tense waiting. Ron is compelled to hitch a ride with an ambulance that is traveling toward Ground Zero on 9/11 because of the severe traffic that occurs throughout the day in the New York City metro area. The squads had to maneuver across opposing traffic, making the hike take up to 6 hours, and Sneha was nowhere to be seen. Ron gets to Tribeca at 9 o'clock at night to see that the World Trade Center crash site has been blocked off by the NYPD. He can go through with his medical credentials and dash to his residences. Sadly, the front doors are locked owing to the local power outage, so Ron is forced to seek refuge at his friend's West Village apartments. On September 12th, the next morning, Ron gets up and returns to Battery Park, where he may at last enter the apartment complex. He goes upstairs, enters his apartment, and discovers that a bedroom window has been left open, and the entire apartment is covered in soot from the fall of the tower. Ron searches the floor for human tracks as he suddenly thinks he can take use of the soot. Unfortunately, all he discovers are the couple's 2 kitten-strewn paw tracks, indicating that Sneha was unable to return after the World Trade Center collapsed. Ron chooses to submit a missing persons complaint with the NYPD, one of the over 9,000 missing persons reports that were made in the immediate wake of 9/11, after conducting additional checks with Sneha's acquaintances and relatives. Over the next few days, Ron decided to go looking for his wife. When he contacted American Express to report the loss of his credit card, they informed him that the last transaction had occurred on September 10th at the Century 21 department store. Ron then made his way to that very store, where he hangs flyers for Sneha about missing people in and around the aisles. Ron gets a call later that week from a former worker at the Century 21 store, who tells him she saw Sneha on the evening of the 10th. Ron is also informed by the employee that Sneha was with someone else in the store that day, and she thought the other person was another Indian woman. Ron returns with this information to Century 21, where he is given access to 3 weeks' worth of security camera footage. At this point, he discovers the CCTV image of his spouse shopping for clothing. But in every clip when she appears, she is by alone. Ron recruited private investigator Ken Gallant after waiting for the NYPD to start their investigation and being angry with their uncaring attitude about her 911 fates. At first, the investigator thought it was possible that Sneha had used the assaults on the World Trade Center as a pretext to flee her personal problems and begin anew in an unidentified location. This notion, however, is short-lived as Gallant and Ron concur that Sneha most likely returned to the apartments on September 11th, witnessed the assaults in real time, and made the decision to head to Ground Zero and use her medical experience to help the injured right away. Although her remains were never found, this is most likely the place where she passed away. When enough proof is gathered, Ron brings this to the attention of the police. He discovers that the NYPD is conducting a separate investigation into her disappearance because of her unpredictable behavior and criminal past, leading them to believe that she was the victim of foul play rather than a 911 call. In 2003, Lieberman objects to the NYPD's conclusion of his wife's investigation and maintains that she should continue to be recognized as a victim of the 911 incident. He also requests access to the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund in exchange for his efforts to find his wife and try to bring her home. The NYPD submits these results to the courts hearing Ron's claim. However, they finally determine that there is insufficient evidence to establish Sneha was a victim of the World Trade Center attacks, and in January 2004, her name and the names of 2 other individuals are struck from the official list of deceased. Disbelieving, Ron and the Philip family fight valiantly to challenge this decision, claiming that the police falsified their conclusions by using circumstantial evidence and family testimony. While Sneha's disappearance was not a direct result of the 911 terrorist attacks, the defense contended at the appeal hearing in the late winter of 2008 that it was highly likely given that her route home that morning would have taken her directly past Ground Zero at the moment when the Twin Towers were first hit. As a result, there was more conjecture because Sneha was in the area and her status as an official victim of the worst day in contemporary American history was reinstated. Notwithstanding the decision, Sneha and Phillips's tale has been one of doubt rather than possible bravery, blaming her early adult troubles on her status as missing and alleging that Ron Lieberman and her relatives took use of her disappearance for personal financial benefit. Naturally, the majority of the 9,000 missing person reports that passed through law enforcement in the days and weeks following the 9/11 attacks included the regrettable disclaimer that the majority, if not all, would discover evidence and clues lost in the cracks. It was just too chaotic and hysterical to conduct appropriate investigations. Not to mention the fact that a large number of these allegations are either duplicates or cases where the victim was discovered by the police or the victim's family to be one of the assault's own victims. If there's any silver lining, it's that a large portion of New York City has copious amounts of CCTV and security cameras in every nook and cranny throughout the metro. The problem with this scenario, of course, is that a lot of security cameras were either turned off or left unattended on the morning of September 11th and in the days that followed. In an attempt to unravel the 9/11 conspiracy, local, state, and federal authorities in New York City made every effort to confiscate as much video as they could. They had no idea, however, that despite their delays, these preservation efforts ultimately benefited the smaller studies just as much. This is the exact circumstance that affected Sneha and Philip's search and offered the crucial hint for determining what might have happened to her on September 10th evening or on September 11th. Upon conducting an investigation into Sneha's disappearance, private investigator Ken Gallant discovered surveillance footage from the main lobby of the Rector Place apartments in Battery Park, where the couple had lived for approximately a year. The recordings demonstrated that at 8:43 a.m. on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, a woman entered the lobby of Rector Place, made her way to the elevator, stood for a brief while, and then left. Sadly, these cassettes are not available to us. Nonetheless, they were included in the official case files of Ken Gallant and submitted to the courts during the judge-led argument of Sneha's case. According to the documents, the angle of the sun's rays coming through the lobby window starkly contrasted with the quality of the CCTV picture, yet the woman's fundamental features could still be seen. According to Ron's testimony, the person in the picture had his wife's mannerisms, had a ponytail or hairdo that was comparable to Sneha's at the time, and even had clothing that looked like Sneha's from the earlier Century 21 security clip. There are other indications that the woman might be Sneha. Another important hint is the time of day. Ron stated in court that Sneha would usually be home between 7:09 a.m. and 8 a.m. the next day if she didn't come home after a night out, which wasn't too often. The timestamp, which is around 8:43 a.m., follows the pattern exactly. Despite having only seen the woman's case file and never having met her in person, an NYPD investigator who also gave testimony during the court proceedings even went so far as to declare he thought the woman was Sneha Philip. The main refutation of the assertion is that Sneha would have been clutching bags or other goods after returning to the flat for the first time since her shopping excursion, which the woman in the security tape isn't seen carrying. But this could be the reason the woman exited the foyer at Rector Place after spending a minute or two there. If Sneha was the person, perhaps she realized she had left her Century 21 luggage at home or at the train and hurried out to get them when she got there. Some believe that Sneha's departure from the lobby was actually her response to hearing the first plane crash into the World Trade Center's North Tower, even though it was only a few blocks away, and that the timing on the CCTV system was inaccurate by a minute or two. Clocks and CCTV systems are often programmed with the most precise timestamp available. It is impossible to prove either way, though. Furthermore, it's reasonable to doubt the footage's veracity in terms of timing given the enormous panic around 9/11 that soon followed its recording. Whatever the case, the hidden security tapes are the most significant lead into Sneha's disappearance and contribute to the innumerable ideas that have been developed since Ron's first attempts to track down his missing wife. Now let's discuss the most widely accepted ideas of Sneha's disappearance. In the years after America's Darkest Hour, a variety of ideas regarding Sneha's and Philip's status have spread like wildfire through the internet and investigative organizations. The majority of them ideas conclude that Sneha was a victim of the 9/11 disaster and had some connection to it. But the most radical notion deviating from that line of reasoning came from the NYPD, the organization in charge of tracking Sneha down. Following months of contemplation, Ron decided to use all available resources to locate his wife, which is why he paid Ken Gallant for his services. This was caused in part by the NYPD's extraordinarily heavy caseload after the 9/11 attacks, as well as their initial lack of interest in Sneha's case. They refused to look into it further, insisting she was most likely a victim of the Twin Towers attack. Ron was initially shocked, thinking his wife couldn't have been at the towers and certain that something had happened to her the previous evening. Fortunately, both guys changed their minds and realized that Sneha was most likely a victim of 9/11 thanks to Ken Gallant's expert understanding and investigative work. In an odd turn of events, however, as Ron and Gallant arrived at this conclusion, law enforcement reverted to Ron's initial hypothesis. It turned out that Sneha had caused her own disappearance. Thus, the NYPD was looking into her disappearance from that angle. Naturally, Ron demanded a thorough explanation, as any bewildered widower would. Having recently come to terms with the devastating reality that his wife and 3,000 other people perished on September 11th, 2001. Was there something he missed? It turned out that the NYPD had been compiling a fairly extensive and thorough history of Sneha's life, one that was centered on her legal troubles and other personal problems that Ron had long since ceased linking to her disappearance, rather than her medical degree or her love of painting. Beginning with Sneha's last days as a resident of the Cabrini Medical Center, where she completed her internship, these in-death reports were written. Since Sneha was considered an intern, she was not eligible for a direct termination. She was, however, advised that her contract would not be renewed because of problems resulting from her alcohol usage and tardiness. Sneha continued to socialize outside of the medical center with her former co-workers in spite of this. Shortly after receiving the unfavorable news, Sneha went out to a bar with her friends one evening to socialize and have a few drinks. Sneha, on the other hand, had a violent argument with one of her younger friends and ended up spending the next 12 hours in jail. Sneha allegedly filed a criminal complaint with the police alleging that one of the interns had touched her improperly and groped her. This in turn was also taken into custody and charged with forcible touching. However, following a brief probe, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the NYPD decided to dismiss the charges against the alleged intern. Instead, they made a complete 180-degree turn and charged Sneha with a misdemeanor for filing a false complaint. If you find this hard to hear, try to envision how Sneha felt at the time. Furthermore, she was informed by the prosecution team that if she merely withdrew the first complaint, all charges would be withdrawn. She was not at all comfortable with this. She was not going to give up on her assault tale and stop advocating for herself. She so rejected the DA's offer and persisted with her first assertion. Sneha was consequently placed in handcuffs and given a one-night jail sentence, which she complied with by spending the night in meditation with another prisoner. But the NYPD reports didn't end there. They even went so far as to incorporate Ron's contribution to Sneha's life, or rather, its seeming absence in the equation. Official reports state that Sneha was found to have been spending whole evenings out in Manhattan with random people and people she would meet at the several homosexual, LGBTQ+ friendly clubs including Julie's, Henrietta Hudson's, and Meow Mix. The problem was, Ron was aware of his wife's late-night antics. He informed her it was okay as long as she called to let him know she was safe and in good hands, even though he didn't know the identities of every acquaintance she made. Furthermore, Ron informed the NYPD that Sneha's choice of bars had no bearing on their marital status. Ron provided an excellent answer, stating that Sneha had no interest in being approached at regular bars, particularly after the intern episode had such a negative outcome for her. But the NYPD's fabricated charges didn't end there. A purported interview with Sneha's brother, who claimed to have told police he had witnessed Sneha having sex with his girlfriend at the time, was also included in their files. However, when asked about this during the appeal hearing, Sneha's brother angrily denied ever having said these things, much less taking part in an interrogation concerning that particular incident in general. Most damning of all, according to the police records, Sneha and Ron got into a heated verbal altercation on the grounds of the courtroom on September 10, 2001, following a court procedure for her criminal charge appeal. Ron stormed off, leaving Sneha stunned on her own. The issue is that Ron claims this never happened. He claimed that although they had a purposeful conversation, nothing got out of hand, and that he left for work as usual following his morning's proceedings at the court. Given all of these fabricated incidents and circumstantial evidence, the police concluded that Sneha had vanished on her own volition. Either she would fall into problems for her late-night antics, or she would use 9/11 to stage her own death and flee in order to start over, running away from the sins that followed her. But Ken Gallant had already ruled out a staged death. Though he conducted the appropriate research, he had the same first suspicions. Searching Stina's computer files, Gallant saw nothing that would typically indicate someone looking into beginning a new life. She also stored her passports, glasses, driver's license, and nearly all of her credit cards in the apartments. The most obvious clue was the glasses. She hardly ever traveled outside of the boundaries of New York City without them. Could Sneha have been killed on her night out, as the NYPD initially believed, if she had not fled? Though it's not likely, it's also not impossible. Sneha had already spent the evening drinking and socializing at bars and new acquaintances' apartments throughout the city. Not only did she know who not to hang out with, but she also clearly understood the risks that women in large cities confront when they go to bars. Had she not known how to protect herself and noticed the warning signs, she would not have done what she did. Additionally, there was no illegal activity on September 10th night that would have called for a murder investigation. There were no unresolved murders, missing Indian women, bar shootings, or documented abductions. Of course, on September 11th, there were hardly any crimes reported at all, and at the end of the day, there had only been one unsolved homicide. A pattern of disappearances outside the obvious Twin Towers fatalities in the days preceding and after 9/11 has likewise not been found in the New York City area. Actually, there is just one contested report of missing persons during the week of September 11th. That is Fernando Molinar's situation. When Molinar spoke to his mother over the phone on September 8, 2001, about his new employment at a nearby pizzeria close to the World Trade Center, that was the last time anyone saw or heard from him. Although his actual start date was never disclosed, he hadn't started yet. A Dutchess County judge rejected the petition in January 2004 to list him as an official death, even though he appeared to 911 as a clear candidate for victim status. Sneha and Molinar are not really related, other than the fact that they were both immigrants to the United States. In regards to Sneha and Philip's case, we concur with her husband, Ron, private investigator, Ken Gallant, the Philip family, and, as of late, the whole Dutchess County courts that Sneha died as a consequence of the World Trade Center attacks on September 11, 2001. In addition, we think Sneha was under a lot of pressure to start a new life and job, go to medical school, and deal with many important issues in her life. But it was not the kind of incident that would make someone want to start over and throw everything away. It wasn't Sneha's medical license or capacity to practice that was lost. It was her employment. After all, she had another job already. It would have been more logical for Sneha to spend the night at the locations that brought her the greatest joy. That morning, she had to handle a tense court session and felt it was preferable to stay out after shopping all evening. Who knows where she went exactly? Asking people where they were on September 10th isn't exactly fair because for some New Yorkers who were present during the event and do not understand the fascination or desire to talk about it in the same way that the rest of the world often does, talking about 911 is an extremely triggering topic. Although regrettable, it's a valid issue, and it deserves our respect. All we can say is that it makes perfect sense that Sneha would have run to Ground Zero on Tuesday morning to assist in any way she could after witnessing the attacks taking place at the Twin Towers. The first indication is clear. Sneha had dedicated the better part of 6 years of her life to following in her father's footsteps and becoming a doctor. She wanted to continue his legacy of kindness and concern for everyday people because she was moved by it. When it came right down to it, she wanted to use her skills to help keep more people alive and well because she loved them. Sneha would have been among the first to put her head down and take action if a jet had crashed into the Twin Towers and there had been an obvious crisis. At the time of her disappearance, Sneha was also thinking about the World Trade Center. Do you recall the September 10th instant messaging exchange she had with her mother? She mentioned visiting the Windows on the World restaurants located on the 106th and 107th levels of North Tower 1 WTC. The motivation was a spring 2002 wedding that Sneha would be attending. A friend of hers was being married at the Windows on the World venue. That gave rise to the desire. When Sneha saw the top of the North Tower on fire on the morning of 9/11, it's conceivable that this was the first thing she thought about. Maybe it was her excellent friend who was in serious danger up there. We don't know if Sneha was the woman in the security video from the apartment lobby because we haven't seen the tapes or Sneha herself. But based on a few distinct characteristics, we can infer from the descriptions given and the admissions made by her husband and an investigating detective that the woman did seem to be Sneha. In the end, there were indications that Sneha was still alive just 1 minute before to the 9/11 plane crash. There were no clues or indicators after those awful hours, and Sneha and Philip vanished by dusk, just like almost 3,000 other people had. There is still a possibility that Sneha's remains will be recognized. During the cleanup work following the 9/11 attacks, investigators gathered almost 22,000 individual pieces of human remains from Ground Zero. Many of these have not yet been compared to DNA provided by victims' relatives who want to obtain confirmation of the whereabouts of their loved ones. Snares is among the 1,347 victims of 9/11 whose remains have not yet been located. It could happen that a match appears one day. But as time has gone on, the process of identifying victims has become more and more difficult because a large portion of the DNA either repeats itself or is missing from the system of samples that have been submitted. Even though it's unlikely that we will ever learn the precise circumstances behind Sneha and Philip's deaths, we can still honor her memory as the compassionate physician that she was, a compassionate idealist who aspired to restore health, cure illness, and improve the lives of everyone she encountered. She made the greatest sacrifice in order to fulfill her mission when she passed away. Doctor, it's not clear how many people. No matter how many people Philip looked after that morning beneath the smoking towers, her legacy will endure. We will exhibit our memories and restore honor to the names Sneha and Philip in commemoration of the 3,000 souls lost, and the numerous lives affected by the terrible consequences that have since taken root after September 11th, 2001. Moving on to the next case. Lam Kor-wan. Lam Kor-wan was the first serial killer to strike Hong Kong in 1982. Although he worked as a taxi driver during the day, he was also known as the Rainy Night Butcher and the Jars Killer. Over the course of 7 months, he killed 4 young ladies, burying their bodies under his family's couch and preserving body parts in jars. Every murder was more horrific than the last, involving everything from body parts amputation to asphyxia. Every one of them was documented in spooky films. This man, who was he? And what deranged ideas motivated him? How could these women have become his gullible target? Lam Kor-wan was born on May 22, 1955, in the center of Hong Kong, and had a challenging childhood. With 2 mistresses, a legitimate wife, and 10 kids, his father Lam Wai-lok led a difficult existence. This set the stage for Lam's turbulent upbringing. Lam experienced severe treatment during his formative years. His father violently abused both him and his birth mother when they were living in Malaysia. When Lam was a child, his parents divorced, but it didn't make things any easier. His father's violent attitude stemmed from a horrific event in which he banged his head against a wall, breaking Lam's skull and rendering him unconscious at the age of 2. Following a stay in Brunei from 1957 to 1962, where Lam shared a dormitory with his father's half-siblings and mistresses, he went back to Hong Kong. Even though she did well academically in elementary school, there were difficulties when she transferred to Ricci Middle School in Sham, Shui Pu, for junior high school in 1968. Due to his father's work, Lam had to balance 2 jobs and school, which had an effect on his performance, particularly in maths. By 1970, his scholastic ranking had declined due to the pressures of managing his father's motorbike shop after school. Severe therapy marked the further collapse of his relationship with his father. Lam also started running away from home a lot as a result of this. It had set in as a pattern in his life, one that lasted into middle school. Lam had formally begun working in his father's motorbike shop after completing his secondary education. Later on, he went on to learn how to service air conditioners from a relative. All of this, with its familial issues and difficult moments, had prepared Lam Kor-wan to become the enigmatic figure he would later become. He'd been banished from his house in early 1973 after a falling out with his father. He forced a woman into a public lavatory on Hock Yuan Street and hung home with a knife, and then groped her indecently there. His arrest resulted from this incident. After a medical evaluation, it was determined that Lam had mental health problems, which made him ineligible for a trial or jail. He was thus given a treatment term at King Shan Mental Hospital. Following 102 days of medical care, he was released from the hospital and chose to adopt the name Lam Jokum. By the time he was 19, his family had become aware of his strange preoccupation with the feminine form and his stash of pornography kept within a metal ammunition box. His family did make an effort to assist him, but it didn't seem to be working. His behavior became increasingly unsettling as a result of his inability to be satisfied by these behaviors. After acquiring a Polaroid camera, he started capturing clandestine photos of ladies from beneath lavatory doors, which in turn led the women to pursue him down the street. Later on at their Kwanhong home, he was caught glancing at his sister as she undressed outside the bathroom. The family decided to move to a new location in To Kwa Wan as a result. He shared a room with his younger brother at their new house, using separate bunk bed compartments to divide the space. There was an arrangement. Their possessions were to be kept apart, unhindered by the other side. He got his taxi driver's license in 1978 and went by Lam Kor-wan to begin his official taxi driving career. He was switched to a night schedule about 1980, which meant that his family would only get to see him every 14 to 15 days. He then became suddenly interested in photography in 1981, which led him to start studying this art form. But since he didn't have a darkroom at home to print color images, he went looking for a photo studio. He enrolled in a photography course offered by the Chinese YMCA of Hong Kong at the Waterloo Road Association in order to avoid being suspected. One of his classmates was using Photoshop Tim Sha Shui. Lam made up a tale, saying that she was a part-time photographer who worked in a mortuary and needed help taking autopsy pictures. Amazingly, his account was approved, and in order to prevent colleagues from becoming alarmed, the fellow student created Lam's images. When he drove a night taxi for a year, his mother saw a marked shift in his behavior. He began to disregard personal hygiene, declining to take a shower or change into new clothes. His mother even saw him wandering home in the middle of the night, like a sleepwalker, as his demeanor turned hopeless. At the age of 27, Lam changed on the dreary night of February 3, 1982, from a simple peeping Tom to something more evil. One day, When he was working as a taxi driver in the Tsim Sha Tsui neighborhood, he was looking for clients who were coming home after a night out. And this is where the situation became gloomy. Chan Fong-lan, a clearly drunk woman, emerged from a restaurant at around 4 in the morning, in dire need of a ride. Many taxi drivers refused to take her because of the condition she was in. Lam, who didn't appear to care, welcomed her inside his taxi and offered to drive her home despite this. Halfway through the ride, the inebriated woman asked to halt. Lam also opened the door to throw up as she braked close to a petrol station. Uncertain about her location after this unpleasant incident, she requested Lam to head back the other way. Lam later admitted that he had been reluctant to murder her at first because he was disgusted by her vomiting, but that changed when he decided he could take no more. Still in the Tsim Sha Tsui neighborhood, he went into a garage, circled to the passenger door, and strangled the girl with an electric line. He drove to his house at 5 in the morning, when he usually ended work, and parked in front of the building. He hid the body in a big bag and moved it across the pavement inside his flat building as the street was empty. When Lam went by, the night watchman, who was sleeping on a cot in the entry hall, was still asleep. He moved as stealthily as he could into the apartment, concealing the body beneath the sofa. Lam stayed in his bed for several hours, pretending to sleep while he waited for his family to leave after breakfast. He woke up and got ready in his room after his brother and parents left the flat. Taking 500 yuan out of the victim's pocket, Lam went to the street and bought a power saw. To ensure that everything was well protected, including the baseboards, he covered the floor with plastic. He began to dismember the unfortunate woman's body after placing it on the plastic. Even though he took great care to ensure that no blood was left behind, some of it ended up splashing into the walls. He continued to dismember the victim's body for hours, taking pictures and recordings of the entire procedure. He then gave the videotape the name Serious Secret. He dissected her body into 7 parts, sealing the head, limbs, and torso in a plastic bag after wrapping them in paper. The thing that disturbed me the most was that he preserved the genitalia in a Tupperware container using rice wine. He meticulously cleared the crime scene, wiped the walls and floor, and rolled up the plastic sheet, making sure that nothing remained of the horrific events that had occurred. He stayed hidden from onlookers, making multiple visits to deliver the body parts to his taxi. Feeling confident that he had removed all traces of the unsettling deed, he took his car to the new areas. He halted when he came upon an empty area on the banks of the Xingman River close to Chaten. He was determined to find a remote location to dispose of the body. He removed each parcel from his trunk one at a time and tossed them into the river, making sure no one was watching. The bundles were carried out to sea by the murky waves. The torrential rain carried the limbs from Lucky Plaza to the Bel Air Gardens neighborhood, where they drifted. On the radio, more than a week after the horrific deed, Lam had learnt of a terrifying discovery. On the Xingman River's bank, a limb had been found. More body pieces were found in disturbing ways in the following days, allowing the police to piece together the awful puzzle. Tidal patterns were utilized by investigators to calculate the moment the body was dumped into the river. Notably, one of the arms had an uncommon tattoo, a knife-through heart, that was uncommon for a woman to have at the time. This is what helped them figure out who the victim was. It was Chan Fong-lan, age 21. Even after the authorities issued a public call for witnesses, they encountered regrettable difficulties. The taxi driver did not approach, and the license plate went unnoticed by Chan Fong-lan's friends. Lam didn't learn about the body parts discovery for over a week. The mother of 2 children and nightclub hostess in Tsim Sha Tsui, Chan Fong-lan, was identified by the authorities as the deceased person. The graphic details described Chan's night out with her friends and sister, her taxi ride home, and the terrible end Lam Kor-wan dealt her. Lam Kor-wan had been opportunistic in his first murder, but he had planned his second one very carefully. Being a perfectionist, he was determined to be more organized. He chose to use professional equipment rather than a power saw because he was aiming for surgical precision. He had read up on knives, blades, and scissors, and had even gone so far as to buy specialty surgical instruments and multiple bottles of formaldehyde. Formaldehyde was a colorless, strong-smelling chemical that was used for disinfection and preservation. 3 days after buying his apparatus, on May 29, 1982, Lam had taken another victim. He succeeded with his second target, a pub employee. This time, he picked Chanwan Kit Cooley and used an electric cord to strangle her before escorting her home. He waited in bed, like before, for his family to get home from work before beginning the grisly chore of dismembering the body. Lam had carefully planned the room and given it careful thought for days before acting. In order to keep the floor clear of bloodstains, he had placed a sizable tray underneath the body before getting his video camera. Investigators found that he had positioned the tray beneath the family's parakeet cage after reviewing the footage again. Lam displayed remarkable competence as he dissected the body with meticulous care. After he had done slicing it apart, Lam snapped another photo of each bodily part. After much deliberation and numerous nighttime excursions, he eventually discovered the ideal location for disposing of the body. This time, he packed the body parts inside a large plastic bag and put it in the trunk of his cab. He drove to Hong Kong Island through the tunnel early in the morning. The selected location, a heavily forested residential neighborhood called Tai Hang Road, was located 20 minutes east of the city center. He parked in a conspicuous area of the street and then began to struggle to get the bulky bag out of the trunk. He took it a little distance up to the railing, where he watched it tumble into a muddy gully as he hurled the body over it. Lam thought back on that night's events often in the days that followed, not out of regret or guilt, but rather out of a desire to better himself. 2 weeks later, he made another attack. On June 17, 1982, Ling Sao-wan, a 29-year-old nightclub cleaner, got off the job at 4 in the morning and got into Lam's taxi. She soon suffered her terrible end. Lam took her corpse back to his house and performed a horrifying set of acts on her. He recorded his horrifying deeds, taking pictures and filming them, giving the recording the title Operation Rainy Night. Lam recorded the act of dismemberment with his camcorder set up on the bunk bed, using the selfie feature to capture an uncomfortable degree of detail over what he had done before. This time, he proceeded to cut open the abdomen, remove the bowel, and even try to taste human flesh before giving up on the idea since it made him queasy. Then, on Tai Hang Road, he abandoned the severed limbs in a Hessian bag, starting yet another horrible chapter in this gruesome rampage. Lam had grown bolder with every crime. He had been meticulously planning his next heist at this period. Knowing the pubs in the Tsim Sha Tsui neighborhood, he was aware of the locations where women frequently waited for his cab by themselves. He had intended for the next victim to be a woman from a higher social class, but his first 3 victims had been what he had dubbed terrible girls. He purposefully chose a young woman who looked naive, and it was Ling Wei-sum, 17, this time. On July 2, 1982, Lam had discovered her outside the Tsim Sha Tsui Hotel. Before the final examinations, she had gone to a party at her high school, but she had made the decision to leave after supper. To make sure she got home safely, her high school pals had put her in a taxi. After guiding her to a remote road, Lam parked his vehicle. When he took her wrist and chained her to the front seat, the youngster was horrified. He couldn't have gone home that early. It was just 9:30 p.m. However, he had another purpose for wanting to keep her in his vehicle. Unexpectedly, he desired companionship. He desired to speak with her. He was lonely and in need of company, so he spent hours tying Ling up with questions about her life in general, her family, and her religion. All in all, Lam was having fun with her company. That was insufficient to derail his ghastly scheme. Around 4 in the morning, the adolescent dozed off. At this point, Lam began using the electric cable to strangle her. After that, he carried the defenseless girl's lifeless body home and went about his daily business of waiting for his family to vacate the flat. He recorded after he made sure no one was home by mounting his video camera on a high shelf. This was the footage that the police would eventually play in court. The video was quite unsettling. Lam was acting inappropriately and necrophiliacally with the dead body in the video. It was significant to observe that the young victim's thighs had been burned by a lamp that had fallen on them earlier when he was setting up the lighting apparatus to record his actions. In order to later refer to it as the fourth operation, he also recorded it on camera and took pictures of her. Then he dismembered the body, just as he had done with the victims who would subsequently return to torment him. He left the body on Tai Hang Road thereafter. On August 10, 1982, Lam attempted to expand the picture of his fourth victim that had been severed. By coincidence, Lam's friend's Photoshop enlarger was broken, so Lam's negatives were sent to the Mung Kok branch to be magnified. The branch's picture editors discovered disturbing elements in the processed images during the manual enlargement process, suggesting a possible connection to the mutilation of a human body. Despite his suspicions, the shop's supervisor called the police because of elements such as an image of a severed breast and a burn mark on the victim's thigh. The Kowloon Regional Homicide Squad was given the case by the police once they received the report. Detective Sergeant Lee Kwan guided detectives in getting statements from the Tsim Sha Tsui and Mong Kok branch clerks, obtaining the negatives and pictures. Comprehensive examinations were carried out by the Scientific Forensics Department's forensic officer. The corpse in the photo had been dead for less than 3 hours, according to an analysis of the skin and blood color. The dismemberment style indicated a lack of medical anatomical understanding on the part of the culprit, ruling out the notion that they were instructional images. The standard green sheet used for autopsies was conspicuously missing. Experts in forensics also verified that the images were taken directly from a real corpse rather than from printed material. Plus, in one picture, a tiny droplet of water mirrored half the face of a girl who looked like Ling Wai Sim, who had disappeared on July 2nd. The police decided to make an arrest after coming to the conclusion that Lang had been murdered based on the findings of the Scientific Forensics Division and the medical examiner. Sergeant Lee had led the crew in an ambush at the Photoshop early on August 17th. He asked the clerk to combine a few more pictures with Lam's collection of 13 and encouraged him to talk with Lam about the pictures, where they were taken, and why they were enlarged. The intention was to capture the dialogue and acquire proof. Lam arrived by cab at around 6 o'clock in the evening to pick up the pictures. In response to his friend's request, he carefully examined each picture and clarified that the larger versions would be utilized for courtroom presentations, especially so jurors could see the contents more clearly. According to Lam, he worked in several mortuaries on a regular basis. Sergeant Lee revealed his name, verified the pictures, and made the payment. He then arrested Lam. At first, Lam made up a false narrative, claiming that the images belonged to a purported four-eyed man from the Oriental Daily that he was going to see at Tokwawan. Investigations, however, showed that there was no such individual. As a result, the authorities moved quickly to acquire a search warrant so they could examine Lam's home in the allotted 48 hours and gather tangible evidence. They would have had to release him otherwise. In Lam's cabinets, they found surgical instruments, personal belongings, preservatives, anatomical books, and severed body parts, including the dead women's breasts and vaginas. Additionally, his taxi was seized and searched by the police, who also left a notice on the windscreen indicating that it was involved in a crime and instructing not to have it towed. After the car was examined further, evidence was found in the glove compartment, including wire and handcuffs. There were also 2 holes in the back of the front seat, which were probably made by one of the dead women's high heels during a struggle. Investigators allegedly uncovered a vast archive that included 696 negatives, 1,500 color slides, and 1,900 carefully classified photos that showed Kor-wan's victims at different points in his crimes. His careful documentation greatly facilitated the police inquiry. The body parts of all his victims were eventually found by authorities, allowing for their identification and return to their individual families. To help with the inquiry, Lam Kor-wan was taken to the police station with his father and younger brother. Authorities thought that Lam and his brother had not acted alone, given their small living area and the amount of evidence found in their single bedroom. After being detained and questioned extensively for 3 days, Lin was freed. The younger Lam stated that he had little contact with his brother because of their divergent schedules and that he was unaware of or did not participate in the incidents. Their father and younger brother pushed Kor-wan to make it clear that they had nothing to do with it in order to expedite their release. Lam's mother went to the police station also, hoping to talk her son into confessing. Kor-wan helped the police identify the victim's body parts, but even with their assistance, the police continued to suspect that the younger Lam might be involved. As a result, the two brothers were brought before the Sampokong Magistrates Court and charged with 4 charges of murder. After that, they were moved to the Su Lam Psychiatric Center for evaluation. In keeping with the younger brother's repeated claims of innocence, he was ultimately freed following the 6th hearing on the grounds of inadequate evidence. In the meantime, a medical examination determined that Kor-wan was competent to stand trial, demonstrated an extraordinarily high IQ, reportedly over 130, and was of sound mind. After the establishment of prima facie evidence, the matter was forwarded to the Supreme Court for a trial. On March 3, 1983, the trial began, and a large crowd gathered outside the court to see Lam's behavior. The case's specifics, according to the authorities, were too upsetting for women. To guarantee a fair trial, 7 carefully chosen male jurors were chosen. Only the jurors, judges, and attorneys were permitted to watch Lam's videotapes so order to avoid shock. The organs of the victim were also kept out of the courtroom. The prosecution called witnesses throughout the trial, including members of Lam's family, the police office, Photoshop employees, and forensic and scientific specialists. Acknowledging the strength of the evidence against him, Lam attempted to reach a compromise by confessing to manslaughter in return for a shorter sentence. But this appeal was turned down. The jury was instructed by the court to choose between manslaughter and murder charges rather than discuss Lam's culpability. The trial featured testimony from 5 psychiatrists and delves into arguments over Lam's mental health. 2 questioned his self-control, while 3 implied an infatuation with women. 18 days later, on April 8th of that year, the judge gave the jury instructions to find that Lam had some degree of control over his conduct during the crimes. Following more than 3 hours of discussion, the jury unanimously concluded that Lam was guilty of murder, insane. Lam was originally given a hanging death sentence, but thanks to the governor's pardon, his sentence was reduced to life in prison when Hong Kong abolished the death penalty in 1984. Following his conviction, Lam was first housed at Stanley Prison before being moved to Shekpik Prison, where he was known to the other convicts as Lam. He was a reserved man who avoided talking about his history and preferred to be by himself. According to reports, he was paid little, kept to himself, and didn't socialize much. He took part in Catholic and Christian classes while incarcerated and read newspapers, medical, and religious materials. He didn't have any family visits, although he did occasionally get visits from church volunteers. Newspapers and books littered his cell, and he became well known among the other prisoners for his expertise in purple star astrology, a kind of Chinese fortune-telling. Prison guards asked him for advice. Lam applied for parole in 2018, after serving for more than 34 years at the age of 62, which alarmed the public. The parole board reviews the case every 5 years. However, at that time, they decided not to grant parole due to worries about the possibility of repeat offenses. Additionally, according to reports, Lam was observed by some inmates making elaborate displays out of cockroaches that were kept in matchboxes. Lam's mother testified during the 1983 trial regarding the physical abuse her oldest son suffered as a youngster. She described how Kor-wan's father had been abusive, even inflicting significant head damage on the boy when he was only 2 years old, which left him with 2 black eyes. She had been abused as a child in the household as well. Experts have connected serious brain traumas sustained as a kid to psychological problems later in life, including necrophilia. According to reports, Lam told a doctor that he thought God had given him the go-ahead to carry out the murders. There is still uncertainty around Lam's behavior after the probe. Investigators were baffled as to why, despite having the appropriate equipment, he chose to process films at a Kodak store. Others surmised that, having been dangerously close to being arrested once, he he may have secretly wanted to be arrested. The gruesome results of the autopsy and the manner in which the victims were mutilated suggested the presence of a skilled killer. Nevertheless, because of the case's publicity, Lam's family had difficulties in spite of these horrifying facts. They tried to sell their flat, but the high profile of the building made it difficult, so they were forced to stay. After the investigation was closed, the police destroyed all of Lam's videos and images out of concern for possible public attention. Nevertheless, a few of the victims' organs had an unexpected outcome. For instructional reasons, they are kept at the Wan Chai Forensic Medicine headquarters. In a somber acknowledgement of the lives lost to his son's malice, Lam's father dedicated a memorial tablet at Yuanjing College on November 16, 1986, hoping to atone for his son's transgressions. We must pay tribute to these 4 innocent women whose lives were sadly lost as we come to the end of Lam Kor-wan's eerie tale. The story of Lam Kor-wan serves as a chilling reminder of the intricacies of the human psyche and the terrible outcomes they can have. These are clear reminders that mental health needs to be given more attention and that a greater knowledge of it is necessary. In the maximum security Shekpik prison on Lontu Island, Lam Kor-wan, now 68, is serving a life sentence for the gruesome killings that rocked Hong Kong in the early 1980s. His reputation as the first serial killer in the city was cemented into history. At the age of 27, his horrific reign came to an end on August 17, 1982, the day of his arrest. His eerie post-crime customs, such as concealing victims under the family sofa and cannibalizing body parts, led to him being dubbed the Rainy Night Butcher and the Jars Murderer. Such unsettling behaviors provide a terrifying image of a troubled mind. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with us. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps us bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.